Nearly 5 years had passed since the night Thomas Hargrove died in his own cornfield, and Deputy Mara Voss had settled into a life she once would have found unimaginable, a life split evenly between ordinary small-town law enforcement and the quiet, careful stewardship of a secret that still occasionally kept her awake long after midnight. BlackWell had weathered 4 consecutive blood moon cycles without further violence, each ceremony proceeding smoothly thanks to the expanded network of founding families Mara and Ellis Hargrove had painstakingly organized in the aftermath of that first catastrophic night. She had grown comfortable with the rhythm of it, the careful record-keeping, the periodic maintenance of the ancient scarecrow standing sentinel in the Hargrove field, the correspondence with a small circle of regional contacts who shared fragments of similar, isolated traditions from their own scattered communities. She had allowed herself, cautiously, to believe that BlackWell's particular danger had finally been brought under some manner of lasting, sustainable control. That comfortable belief ended on a cold evening in late September, when her phone rang with a call from Diane Ashworth, the local historian from the town of Ashford Hollow roughly 80 miles east, the same woman who had first shared the unsettling old survey map suggesting a wider, ancient network of containment sites scattered throughout the region. Diane's voice, when Mara answered, carried a raw, barely controlled panic that Mara had heard only once before in her life, in her own voice, on the night everything in BlackWell had gone terribly wrong. Diane explained, in halting, frightened sentences, that something had gone badly wrong in Ashford Hollow 3 nights earlier, that several residents had been found dead under circumstances the local sheriff's department could not explain, and that she strongly suspected the violence was connected to the very containment tradition she and Mara had spent years cautiously discussing through careful, guarded correspondence. Mara felt her stomach drop as she listened, old memories of that first catastrophic night in BlackWell rising unbidden and vivid in her mind, the smell of blood in the cornfield, Thomas Hargrove's motionless body, the scarecrow's hollow eyes tracking her retreat with unnerving, deliberate patience. She asked Diane for every detail she could provide, and Diane described a scene that matched BlackWell's own history with disturbing precision: bodies discovered with savage, unexplained wounds, a local family whose ancestral property held some kind of old effigy or marker that had apparently gone missing from its traditional post sometime in the last week. Mara asked whether Ashford Hollow maintained anything resembling BlackWell's own scarecrow tradition. Diane admitted she had only recently, through her own historical research, begun to suspect her town harbored a similar secret, one apparently far less carefully maintained than BlackWell's own, and that whatever family had traditionally overseen Ashford Hollow's containment obligations seemed to have abandoned or lost track of their responsibilities generations earlier, leaving the town entirely unprepared for whatever danger had now, apparently, broken free of its confinement. Mara immediately contacted Ellis and Sheriff Pruitt, relaying everything Diane had told her, and the 3 of them convened an urgent meeting that same night at the sheriff's department, the same small conference room where they had once pieced together their own desperate response to BlackWell's original crisis 5 years earlier. Ellis listened with the same grim, focused attention he had displayed throughout their years of collaborative research, immediately asking whether Ashford Hollow's situation might pose any direct risk to BlackWell itself, or whether it represented an isolated, separate tragedy unfolding within its own distinct community. Mara admitted she did not yet know, though she reminded them both of the disturbing old survey map Diane had originally discovered, the one suggesting a deliberate, coordinated network of containment sites established by some ancient organization or civilization predating even the region's earliest documented settlements. If that map's implications proved accurate, she explained, there was no way to be certain that whatever had broken free in Ashford Hollow would remain confined to that community's own borders, particularly if the underlying danger there proved more powerful or less contained than BlackWell's own carefully maintained tradition had managed to keep in check. Sheriff Pruitt asked the question Mara had been dreading since Diane's first phone call, whether they should consider traveling to Ashford Hollow directly to assess the situation firsthand and potentially offer whatever hard-won assistance their own experience might provide. After a long, uneasy silence, Mara said what she suspected all 3 of them were already thinking, that if whatever had escaped in Ashford Hollow shared any connection to the ancient network suggested by Diane's research, Ignoring it entirely might prove far more dangerous than confronting it directly. Ellis expressed immediate reservations about traveling to Ashford Hollow, pointing out that his primary responsibility remained ensuring BlackWell's own tradition continued functioning properly, especially with the next blood moon cycle still several months away but requiring careful, ongoing preparation regardless. Mara understood his concern, though she argued that if Ashford Hollow's crisis truly connected to the same broader, ancient network they had spent years cautiously investigating, understanding exactly what had gone wrong there might prove essential to preventing a similar catastrophe eventually reaching BlackWell's own borders. Sheriff Pruitt ultimately sided with Mara, reasoning that his official law enforcement authority might allow them a legitimate pretext for inserting themselves into Ashford Hollow's ongoing investigation without immediately revealing the true, supernatural nature of their genuine interest and concern. He proposed contacting Ashford Hollow's own sheriff department directly, offering interdepartmental assistance under the guise of regional cooperation regarding an unusual, unsolved violent crime, a professional courtesy that would raise considerably less suspicion than an unexplained, unofficial visit from 3 private citizens with no obvious jurisdiction or reason for involvement. Mara agreed this approach offered the most practical path forward, and by the following morning, Pruitt had successfully arranged for himself and Mara to travel to Ashford Hollow as official liaisons assisting with the ongoing investigation, while Ellis remained behind in BlackWell to continue his own ongoing preparations and maintain careful watch over their town's own dormant, ancestral danger, a division of responsibility none of them felt entirely comfortable with, but one that seemed to represent the most reasonable, practical option available given the urgency of the unfolding situation. Mara and Sheriff Pruitt arrived in Ashford Hollow the following afternoon, finding a town considerably larger than BlackWell but sharing the same rural, agricultural character, surrounded by rolling hills and dense stretches of forest rather than the endless cornfields that defined her own hometown's landscape. Diane Ashworth met them at the local sheriff's department, her exhausted, frightened expression confirming everything Mara had already suspected from their earlier phone conversation. Ashford Hollow's sheriff, a heavy-set, weary man named Garrett Boone, briefed them on the official details of the investigation, describing 4 confirmed deaths over the preceding week, each victim discovered with savage, deep wounds that the coroner's office had struggled to attribute to any conventional weapon or known animal. Mara studied the case photographs Boone provided with a grim, sinking recognition, the wounds bearing an unmistakable resemblance to those she had witnessed firsthand on Thomas Hargrove's body 5 years earlier. She asked Boone whether any physical evidence suggested a specific direction of movement or pattern to the killings, and he confirmed that all 4 incidents had occurred progressively farther from a single, central location near the town's eastern edge, an old, largely abandoned farm property that Diane had already identified, through her own careful research, as the likely site of Ashford Hollow's own long-neglected containment tradition. Mara exchanged a knowing, uneasy glance with Sheriff Pruitt, both of them recognizing that whatever ancient danger Ashford Hollow's own founding families had once attempted to contain was almost certainly responsible for this current, escalating wave of violence, and that time to address it was likely running dangerously short. Diane led Mara, Pruitt, and Sheriff Boone toward the abandoned farm property she had identified as the probable source of Ashford Hollow's crisis, explaining along the drive that the land had belonged, generations earlier, to a founding family named Corwin, though the family line had apparently died out or moved away sometime in the previous century, leaving the property to fall into gradual, undisturbed neglect. She had discovered references to the Corwin family within old town records suggesting they had maintained some kind of traditional responsibility similar to the Hargrove family's own ancestral obligations back in BlackWell, though the exact nature of that responsibility had never been clearly documented, and no living Corwin descendant remained in the area to explain or continue whatever practice their ancestors had once faithfully maintained. They arrived at the property to find the old farmhouse collapsed and overgrown, consumed almost entirely by decades of unchecked vegetation, and Mara felt a familiar, uneasy dread settle over her as she surveyed the surrounding fields, noting the absence of any obvious scarecrow or similar effigy that might have served as Ashford Hollow's own equivalent containment vessel. She asked Diane whether her research had identified what specific object or location the Corwin family's tradition had originally centered around. Diane admitted she had found only vague, fragmentary references suggesting some kind of wooden figure or marker, though she had been unable to determine its exact original location or current whereabouts. A gap in knowledge that left all four of them standing amid the overgrown ruins of the abandoned Corwin farm with a deeply unsettling uncertainty regarding exactly what ancient danger they were actually attempting to track down and confront. As they searched the overgrown property for any remaining trace of whatever containment structure the Corwin family might once have maintained, Mara noticed a section of the old field where the vegetation grew noticeably differently than the surrounding area, the grass shorter and more sparse in a roughly circular pattern that suggested something had once stood fixed in that location for a considerable length of time. She pointed this out to the others, and Sheriff Boone confirmed, after consulting some old county property surveys he had brought along, that the location matched a marking on a decades-old map indicating some kind of structure or fixture that no longer appeared on any more recent survey. Diane speculated that this might indeed represent the original site of Ashford Hollow's containment vessel, whatever specific form it had originally taken, and that its apparent absence from the location now suggested the object itself had either been destroyed, removed, or had somehow relocated on its own, a possibility that filled Mara with fresh, urgent dread given everything she had witnessed regarding the animate, purposeful movement the Hargrove scarecrow had displayed during its own brief period of awakening 5 years earlier. She asked Diane whether any historical records suggested what circumstances might cause such a containment vessel to become permanently animated or mobile, rather than returning to dormancy as BlackWell's own scarecrow had eventually done following Ellis's successful ritual intervention. Diane admitted she possessed no clear answer to this troubling question, though she pointed out grimly that whatever object had once stood within this overgrown field was now, in all likelihood, somewhere out in the surrounding countryside, fully awakened and actively hunting, with no family remaining who understood how to locate, confront, or properly return it to whatever dormant state it had presumably maintained for generations before the Corwin family's line had finally died out entirely. Mara suggested that their most immediate priority should involve determining the direction and pattern of the creature's continued movement, reasoning that if they could establish some reliable sense of where it was likely headed next, they might be able to intercept it or at least warn potential victims before additional violence occurred. Sheriff Boone agreed, and using the locations of the 4 confirmed killings, they plotted a rough trajectory suggesting the creature had been moving generally eastward, away from the Corwin farm and deeper into increasingly rural, sparsely populated territory. Mara felt a fresh chill of alarm as she studied this trajectory more carefully, recognizing that if the pattern continued in its current general direction, the creature's path would eventually carry it toward the same broad region where BlackWell itself was located, though still separated by a considerable distance that offered at least some measure of immediate reassurance. She raised this concerning possibility with Sheriff Pruitt, who agreed they needed to contact Ellis immediately to warn him of this developing threat, however distant it currently remained, and to ensure BlackWell's own precautionary measures were reinforced in case the creature's trajectory continued carrying it steadily closer to their own community over the following days or weeks. Diane, meanwhile, continued her own research into the Corwin family's history, hoping to uncover any additional fragmentary knowledge regarding the specific nature of whatever ancient danger their vessel had originally been designed to contain. Information that might prove essential in eventually determining how to properly confront and neutralize the creature before it could claim any additional victims throughout its apparently unpredictable, ongoing rampage across the increasingly wide swath of rural countryside separating Ashford Hollow from Mara's own distant, understandably anxious hometown. That evening, Mara called Ellis to relay everything they had discovered in Ashford Hollow, and she could hear the concern in his voice deepen steadily as she described the pattern of killings, the abandoned Corwin property, and the troubling, generally eastward trajectory that seemed to be carrying the escaped creature slowly but steadily toward BlackWell's own general region. Ellis promised to immediately reinforce BlackWell's own precautionary measures, alerting Sheriff Pruitt's deputies who had remained behind and quietly informing the town's network of participating founding families to maintain heightened vigilance in case the distant threat continued approaching over the following weeks. He also mentioned, with evident unease, that he intended to personally inspect the Hargrove family's own scarecrow more frequently than usual, wanting to ensure their own dormant, contained danger showed no signs of unusual activity or restlessness that might somehow be connected to or influenced by whatever chaos was currently unfolding in the distant community of Ashford Hollow. Mara found this precaution reasonable given everything Diane's research had suggested regarding a possible ancient, interconnected network linking multiple containment sites throughout the wider region, though she hoped fervently that BlackWell's own carefully maintained tradition would prove entirely separate and unaffected by Ashford Hollow's unfolding crisis. She ended the call feeling a familiar, exhausting weight of responsibility settling over her shoulders, understanding that she now faced the difficult task of helping address an active, ongoing threat in an unfamiliar community while simultaneously worrying about the safety of her own hometown, hundreds of miles away and, she desperately hoped, still safely beyond the reach of whatever ancient danger continued its slow, violent progress across the region's darkened, increasingly fearful countryside. Over the following 2 days, Mara and Sheriff Pruitt worked closely with Ashford Hollow's local law enforcement to track the creature's continued movement, coordinating patrol routes and warning systems while Diane continued her historical research into the Corwin family's original tradition. A fifth killing occurred on the second night, discovered the following morning in a wooded area roughly 10 miles farther east than the previous incident, confirming the disturbing, steady progression Mara had feared and further solidifying the general trajectory suggesting the creature's continued movement toward increasingly distant, unfamiliar territory. Mara examined the latest crime scene personally, noting details in the surrounding disturbed earth and broken vegetation that reminded her uncomfortably of the pattern she had witnessed following Thomas Hargrove's own murder 5 years earlier, confirming her growing suspicion that whatever creature Ashford Hollow's ancestors had once contained shared significant similarities with BlackWell's own dangerous, ancestral scarecrow, despite manifesting through an apparently different physical form or vessel. She asked Diane whether her ongoing research had yielded any additional insight regarding what specific object or figure the Corwin family tradition had originally centered around, hoping that understanding the creature's true nature and origin might eventually help them determine an effective strategy for stopping its continued rampage. Diane admitted she had found only a single, tantalizing reference within an old church record mentioning a wooden effigy the Corwin family had apparently constructed and maintained for generations, though the record provided no clear description of its appearance or specific ritual requirements, leaving Mara and her companions still frustratingly uncertain regarding exactly what dangerous, ancient force they were now racing against time to locate and somehow contain before it could claim any additional innocent victims throughout its continued, violent journey across the region. On the third night since the killings began, a local farmer reported a strange sighting to Ashford Hollow's sheriff department, describing a tall, gaunt figure moving through his property under cover of darkness, its form vaguely humanoid but disturbingly wrong in its proportions and movement, consistent with descriptions Mara had heard regarding similarly awakened containment vessels from other communities throughout the region. Mara, Sheriff Pruitt, and Sheriff Boone rushed to the reported location, though by the time they arrived, the creature had already moved on, leaving behind only broken fencing and a single set of elongated, unnatural footprints pressed deep into the soft earth near the property's edge. Mara photographed the tracks carefully, noting their similarity to descriptions from her own department's old case files documenting BlackWell's original crisis decades earlier, though these particular prints appeared somewhat different in their exact shape and proportion, suggesting the Ashford Hollow creature's physical form differed meaningfully from the straw-stuffed scarecrow vessel that had animated within the Hargrove family's own ancestral cornfield. She followed the tracks a short distance before losing them entirely at the edge of a dense, unfamiliar wooded area, and stood there in the darkness, straining her senses for any sign of the creature's continued presence nearby. Sheriff Boone suggested organizing a more comprehensive search effort come daylight, reasoning that a larger, coordinated team might prove more effective at tracking the creature's movement than their current small, improvised group, though Mara privately worried that any delay would only allow the creature additional time to claim further victims or continue its steady, relentless progression toward whatever ultimate destination its ancient, driving instincts seemed determined to carry it. The following morning, Diane made a significant breakthrough in her ongoing historical research, locating a detailed personal diary belonging to a Corwin family member from several generations earlier, preserved within the County Historical Society's archive under a mistaken catalog entry that had apparently caused it to be overlooked by previous researchers. The diary described, in considerable if unsettling detail, the family's traditional responsibility for maintaining what its author referred to only as the Hollow Man, a wooden effigy constructed from timber harvested during a specific, ritually significant time of year, animated periodically by the same kind of ancient, malevolent presence that BlackWell's own scarecrow tradition had been established to contain. The diary described a ritual bearing clear similarities to the Hargrove family's own ancestral practice, though centered around a different celestial alignment entirely, one connected not to a blood moon but to a specific alignment of stars occurring only once every several decades, an alignment Diane quickly confirmed, through careful astronomical research, had indeed occurred within the preceding month, explaining the timing of the creature's sudden, catastrophic awakening. Mara felt a chill of recognition reading through Diane's translated summary of the diary's contents, understanding now that the broader, ancient network suggested by the old survey map likely involved multiple different containment traditions, each triggered by its own distinct celestial timing rather than sharing a single, universal schedule, a realization that considerably complicated any hope of establishing a simple, unified understanding of how to properly address or predict future crises. Throughout the wider regional network they had only just begun to genuinely comprehend. The Corwin diary offered one additional piece of crucial information that Mara found simultaneously hopeful and deeply unsettling, a brief passage describing a previous instance of the Hollow Man's awakening several generations earlier, during which the family had successfully returned the creature to dormancy using a combination of fire and a specific, carefully worded incantation remarkably similar in structure to the one Ellis's own grandfather had documented within his family's parallel BlackWell tradition. Diane theorized that this similarity suggested both traditions likely originated from the same ancient source or organization, further supporting the troubling implications of the old survey map's suggestion of a deliberately coordinated, widespread network of containment sites established across the region by some unknown, ancient authority. Mara studied the diary's transcribed incantation carefully, comparing it against her own notes from Ellis's grandfather's journal, and confirmed that while the specific wording differed somewhat, the underlying structure and apparent function of both passages showed clear, meaningful parallels that seemed unlikely to represent mere coincidence. She shared this discovery immediately with Sheriff Boone and the broader investigative team, suggesting that they might be able to successfully employ a similar fire and incantation-based strategy to finally contain the Hollow Man, provided they could first locate the creature and lure it into an appropriately controlled, contained environment. Sheriff Boone expressed cautious optimism at this potential strategy, though he pointed out the significant practical challenge of successfully tracking down and cornering a creature that had already demonstrated considerable speed and cunning throughout its 5 confirmed killings across an increasingly wide swath of rural countryside, a challenge that Mara recognized would require careful, coordinated planning if they hoped to successfully execute the dangerous containment strategy before the creature could claim any additional innocent victims. Working from the Corwin diary's description of the original successful containment ritual, Mara, Diane, and Sheriff Boone began planning a strategy to lure the Hollow Man back toward its original farm property, reasoning that whatever ancient, instinctive connection tied the creature to its ancestral location might make it more susceptible to containment there than in unfamiliar, open countryside where it currently continued its unpredictable, violent wandering. They coordinated with Sheriff Pruitt to gather sufficient fuel and materials for an elaborate fire perimeter similar to the one that had successfully contained BlackWell's own scarecrow 5 years earlier, while simultaneously working to establish additional patrol coverage throughout the surrounding area to monitor for any further sign of the creature's movement or additional violence. Diane continued researching the diary's remaining pages for any additional detail that might improve their chances of successfully executing the containment ritual, while Mara found herself growing increasingly anxious about the considerable time pressure involved, understanding that every additional day of delay meant additional risk of further deaths occurring somewhere throughout the creature's continued, unpredictable rampage. That evening, as their preparations continued, a sixth killing was reported, this one occurring disturbingly close to the town of Ashford Hollow's own residential center rather than the sparsely populated rural areas where the previous incidents had all occurred, suggesting the creature's confidence and boldness were increasing steadily even as its pattern of movement continued its general, troubling progression toward the wider region encompassing Mara's own distant, increasingly vulnerable hometown of BlackWell. The sixth killing, occurring at the edge of Ashford Hollow's own town limits, triggered widespread panic throughout the community, forcing Sheriff Boone to implement emergency measures considerably more visible and disruptive than the careful, discreet precautions BlackWell had managed to maintain during its own original crisis 5 years earlier. Local news outlets began reporting on the string of unexplained deaths, describing them in vague terms attributed to an unidentified wild animal, though the growing public alarm made it increasingly difficult for Mara, Diane, and the local authorities to maintain the kind of careful secrecy that had allowed BlackWell's own community to eventually process and move past their original catastrophic crisis without widespread, lasting public panic or scrutiny. Mara worried that this increasing public attention might eventually complicate their efforts to properly execute the ritual containment strategy, particularly if frightened residents began taking matters into their own hands or interfering with the carefully planned trap they were still in the process of preparing near the abandoned Corwin property. She discussed this growing concern with Sheriff Boone, who agreed to implement a temporary curfew and expanded security presence throughout the town, hoping to keep residents safely contained within their homes while the containment team finished their preparations and awaited an opportunity to properly execute their dangerous, uncertain plan. As the night progressed without any further reported violence, Mara allowed herself a small measure of cautious hope that perhaps the creature had temporarily settled into some kind of dormant pause following its recent, bold attack near the town's residential center, though she recognized this pause likely represented only a brief, temporary reprieve rather than any genuine resolution to the escalating crisis still very much unfolding throughout Ashford Hollow's increasingly fearful, besieged community. 2 days later, with their fire perimeter and containment preparations finally nearing completion near the abandoned Corwin farm, Mara received an urgent call from Ellis back in BlackWell, his voice carrying a barely controlled alarm that immediately set her own nerves on edge. He explained that their own dormant scarecrow had exhibited unusual, unexplained movement overnight, discovered the following morning standing at a slightly different angle than its traditional, fixed position, despite no obvious sign of wind damage or other conventional explanation for the shift. Mara felt genuine fear grip her chest at this news, recognizing the deeply troubling implication that whatever ancient network connected Ashford Hollow's Hollow Man to BlackWell's own scarecrow might indeed be causing some form of sympathetic disturbance or restlessness within their own supposedly secure, properly contained tradition. She relayed this alarming development immediately to Diane and Sheriff Boone, and together they began urgently discussing whether their planned containment strategy for the Hollow Man needed to be accelerated, given the growing possibility that a prolonged delay might risk destabilizing not just Ashford Hollow's immediate crisis, but potentially BlackWell's own carefully maintained containment as well. Sheriff Boone agreed that time was becoming an increasingly critical factor, and the team made the difficult decision to attempt executing their containment plan that very night, despite lingering uncertainty regarding whether their preparations were truly sufficient to successfully lure and contain a creature whose full capabilities and behavior patterns remained only partially understood even after days of intensive, dedicated research and observation throughout the surrounding countryside. As darkness fell that evening, the containment team positioned themselves near the abandoned Corwin farm, having spent the preceding hours carefully preparing the fire perimeter and reviewing the incantation Diane had translated from the old family diary, hoping desperately that the ritual's ancient, decades-old effectiveness would prove sufficient to overcome whatever additional strength or resilience the creature might have developed during its extended period of active, violent freedom. Mara positioned herself near the perimeter's edge alongside Sheriff Pruitt, while Sheriff Boone coordinated a small team of trusted deputies stationed at strategic points throughout the surrounding property, ready to help guide the creature toward the trap should it appear within their monitored area. Diane remained close by, prepared to recite the crucial incantation at the appropriate moment, her voice steady despite the obvious tension and fear evident in her tightly clenched hands and rigid posture. They waited in tense, anxious silence for several hours, the night growing increasingly cold as clouds gradually obscured what had begun as a clear, star-filled sky, until finally, close to midnight, one of Boone's deputies radioed in an urgent report describing movement approaching rapidly from the northern edge of the property, a tall, gaunt shape moving with terrifying speed through the darkened fields toward the very location where the containment team had so carefully prepared their desperate, uncertain trap. Mara felt her heart pounding violently as she watched the approaching shape draw closer, finally gaining a clear, unobstructed view of the creature that had been terrorizing Ashford Hollow for nearly a week. A gaunt, skeletal figure constructed apparently from dark, weathered timber rather than the straw and burlap that comprised BlackWell's own scarecrow vessel, its elongated limbs ending in sharpened, blade-like extensions that explained the savage nature of the wounds inflicted upon its previous victims. The creature paused at the edge of the fire perimeter, its hollow, dark eye sockets studying the assembled flames and torches with the same wary, calculating attention Mara had witnessed from BlackWell's own scarecrow 5 years earlier, apparently recognizing some instinctive danger in the carefully arranged barrier despite its otherwise aggressive, violent behavior throughout the preceding days. Diane began reciting the translated incantation immediately, her voice trembling slightly but growing steadily more confident as she progressed through the unfamiliar, ancient words, while the assembled team watched anxiously for any sign that the ritual was having its intended, restraining effect upon the creature's continued advance. The Hollow Man's movements grew visibly more erratic and hesitant as Diane's recitation continued, mirroring the same internal conflict Mara had witnessed within BlackWell's own scarecrow during Ellis's successful containment ritual years earlier, and for a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed as though their desperate plan might indeed prove successful in finally ending Ashford Hollow's horrifying, week-long nightmare of escalating violence and death. Then, without warning, the creature let out a piercing, inhuman shriek and lunged forward with terrifying speed, breaking through a gap in the fire perimeter that Boone's deputies had apparently failed to adequately reinforce, sending several team members scrambling desperately out of its path as it charged directly toward Diane's position near the ritual's critical center. Mara reacted instinctively, throwing herself between the charging creature and Diane's exposed, vulnerable position, and felt the Hollow Man's bladed limb slash across her forearm in a burning, agonizing wound that sent her staggering backward with a scream she could not fully suppress despite her training and experience. Sheriff Pruitt fired his weapon repeatedly at the creature's retreating form as it continued its violent charge past their position, though the bullets appeared to have minimal effect against its dense, weathered timber construction, merely staggering it momentarily before it recovered and continued its rampage through the scattered, panicked containment team. Diane, despite the chaos erupting around her, continued desperately reciting the incantation's remaining passages, her voice rising with increasingly urgent intensity as she fought to complete the ritual despite the creature's violent, unexpected breakthrough of their carefully prepared perimeter. Mara clutched her bleeding, wounded arm and forced herself back to her feet, understanding with grim, painful clarity that their entire plan was rapidly unraveling into chaos, and that unless something changed dramatically within the following crucial moments, the Hollow Man would likely escape their containment attempt entirely, free to continue its violent, unpredictable rampage across the increasingly wide and vulnerable countryside surrounding Ashford Hollow's terrified, besieged community. Sheriff Boone, recognizing the desperate urgency of the rapidly deteriorating situation, ordered his remaining deputies to reinforce the broken section of the fire perimeter as quickly as possible, hurling additional fuel onto the flames in a desperate attempt to restore the barrier's integrity before the Hollow Man could fully escape its confines. Mara, despite her bleeding arm, grabbed a nearby torch and moved to help block the creature's path back toward the gap it had originally exploited, understanding that every second of continued containment, however imperfect, gave Diane additional crucial time to complete the ritual's remaining passages. The creature turned its attention toward Mara as she approached, its hollow eye sockets fixing upon her with predatory focus, and she felt a fresh surge of terror as it began advancing directly toward her position, its bladed limbs raised in clear preparation for another violent attack. She held her torch defensively, backing away slowly while trying desperately to buy additional time, and watched with a complicated mixture of relief and continued dread as Diane's voice rose to its final, climactic passage, the ancient words echoing strangely across the chaotic, fire-lit scene unfolding throughout the abandoned Corwin property. The hollow man froze suddenly mid-stride, its bladed limbs still raised threateningly toward Mara's exposed, vulnerable position, and let out another piercing, agonized shriek that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet, a sound of obvious pain and resistance that reminded Mara vividly of the same terrifying moment when BlackWell's own scarecrow had finally succumbed to Ellis's desperate, successful ritual intervention 5 years earlier. For several agonizing seconds, the outcome remained uncertain, the hollow man's timber frame shuddering violently as it seemed to fight against whatever restraining, ancient force Diane's completed incantation had finally managed to invoke, its bladed limbs thrashing wildly in what appeared to be genuine, desperate resistance against an increasingly powerful, restrictive influence. Mara remained frozen in place, torch still raised defensively, watching with held breath as the creature's violent movements gradually began slowing, its piercing shrieks fading into a lower, more mournful sound that echoed with unsettling finality across the darkened, fire-lit field. Then, just as suddenly as it had first broken through their perimeter, the hollow man went completely, utterly still, its bladed limbs freezing mid-motion, its hollow eye sockets dimming perceptibly as whatever violent, animate consciousness had driven its week-long rampage finally, mercifully ceased its active, predatory hunting. The assembled team remained tense and uncertain for several long, careful minutes, none of them willing to immediately celebrate what appeared to be their apparent success until sufficient time had passed to confirm the creature had genuinely returned to dormancy rather than merely pausing temporarily before resuming its violent assault. Sheriff Boone eventually approached the motionless figure cautiously, weapon still raised, and after careful examination confirmed that the hollow man had indeed returned to something resembling an ordinary, inanimate wooden effigy, its previously predatory, hollow eye sockets now appearing as nothing more than simple, carved features within an old and weathered piece of timber craftsmanship. Its dangerous, animate potential apparently contained once again, at least for the time being. Mara sank to the ground in exhausted relief once Sheriff Boone confirmed the creature's return to dormancy, her wounded arm throbbing painfully as the adrenaline that had carried her through the desperate confrontation finally began to fade, leaving her acutely aware of the injury's genuine severity. Sheriff Pruitt rushed to her side immediately, examining the wound and confirming it required prompt medical attention despite Mara's initial protests that she wanted to remain and help coordinate the aftermath of their successful, if chaotic, containment effort. Diane, visibly shaken but relieved, approached Mara as paramedics arrived to treat her injury, expressing profound gratitude for Mara's willingness to place herself directly in the creature's path in order to protect her during those final, crucial moments of the ritual's completion. Mara accepted the paramedics' treatment while continuing to discuss the night's events with Sheriff Boone, both of them acknowledging that Ashford Hollow now faced the same difficult, delicate challenge BlackWell had confronted 5 years earlier, establishing a reliable, properly documented system for ensuring the Hollow Man's containment would be faithfully maintained going forward, particularly given the tragic absence of any surviving Corwin family descendant to assume the traditional, ancestral responsibility for the creature's ongoing care and periodic ritual renewal. As she was finally loaded into the ambulance for transport to the nearest hospital, Mara found herself reflecting on the unsettling parallels between this crisis and BlackWell's own original catastrophe, understanding with growing, uneasy certainty that the broader, ancient network Diane's research had first suggested was proving to be considerably more real, more dangerous, and more interconnected than any of them had initially wanted to believe. Mara spent 2 days recovering in Ashford Hollow's local hospital, her arm requiring extensive stitches and a course of antibiotics to prevent infection from what the treating physician described as an unusually deep, jagged laceration unlike anything he had previously encountered in his years of rural medical practice. During her recovery, She maintained close contact with Ellis back in BlackWell, relieved to learn that their own Scarecrow's earlier, unexplained movement had not recurred since the Hollow Man's successful containment, suggesting the two events had indeed been connected through whatever ancient, sympathetic link tied the broader regional network together. Diane visited Mara frequently during her hospital stay, continuing to share updates regarding her ongoing efforts to establish a proper, sustainable stewardship arrangement for the Hollow Man's continued containment, working alongside Sheriff Boone and several other Ashford Hollow residents who had volunteered, after witnessing the crisis firsthand, to assume collective responsibility for the tradition given the Corwin family's unfortunate, permanent absence. Mara found herself feeling a complicated mixture of continued unease and cautious professional satisfaction as she listened to these updates, recognizing that Ashford Hollow's situation, while resolved for the immediate crisis, would require the same kind of careful, ongoing vigilance and institutional development that BlackWell itself had only gradually established over the preceding 5 years. Before returning home to BlackWell, Mara made Diane promise to maintain close, regular contact regarding both Ashford Hollow's continued stewardship efforts and any additional discoveries from her ongoing broader historical research into the ancient network's true origins and extent, a promise Diane readily gave, both of them now bound together by their shared, harrowing experience confronting the Hollow Man's violent, ancient danger. Mara returned to BlackWell exhausted, injured, and profoundly shaken by everything she had witnessed and endured throughout her time in Ashford Hollow, though she found herself genuinely relieved to see Ellis and the familiar, comforting sight of her own hometown's quiet, unassuming cornfields once again. Ellis met her at the sheriff's department upon her return, his relief at seeing her safe evident despite his obvious, lingering concern regarding everything she had described during their phone conversations throughout the preceding week. He immediately took her to inspect the Hargrove Scarecrow personally, both of them wanting to confirm firsthand that their own dormant, ancestral danger showed no continued signs of the unusual restlessness that had briefly manifested during the height of Ashford Hollow's own crisis. They found the Scarecrow standing exactly as it always had, motionless and apparently entirely ordinary in its familiar position at the center of the Hargrove family's cornfield, offering both of them a measure of cautious, relieved reassurance that whatever sympathetic connection had briefly disturbed its usual dormancy had indeed resolved alongside the successful containment of Ashford Hollow's own Hollow Man. Mara shared with Ellis everything she had learned throughout her harrowing experience, including Diane's continued research suggesting the broader, ancient network likely extended considerably further than either of them had initially suspected, potentially connecting numerous scattered communities throughout the wider region, each maintaining their own isolated, imperfectly understood tradition of containment against similarly dangerous, ancient presences whose true collective origin and purpose remained frustratingly obscure despite years of dedicated, collaborative. In the weeks following her return, Mara's arm gradually healed, though the scar left behind by the Hollow Man's bladed attack remained a permanent, visible reminder of everything she had endured throughout Ashford Hollow's terrifying crisis. She resumed her regular deputy duties while continuing to correspond regularly with Diane, tracking Ashford Hollow's ongoing efforts to establish a sustainable, properly documented stewardship system for their own containment tradition. An effort that appeared to be progressing successfully thanks to the dedicated involvement of Sheriff Boone and the handful of volunteer residents who had stepped forward to assume responsibility in the absence of any surviving Corwin descendant. Mara also found herself increasingly preoccupied with the troubling, expanding implications of the broader regional network, spending considerable personal time reviewing everything she and Diane had managed to piece together regarding its likely scope and ancient origins. She began to suspect, based on the growing pattern of evidence, that the network's original establishment predated not just the region's European settlement, but potentially extended back through a far longer, more complex history than any conventional historical record could adequately document or explain. This growing suspicion left her with a persistent, gnawing unease regarding exactly how many other communities throughout the region might currently harbor their own dormant, potentially neglected containment traditions, similar to Ashford Hollow's own tragically abandoned Corwin family responsibility, silently waiting for whatever future celestial alignment might eventually trigger their own catastrophic, Violent awakening. Nearly a month after her return from Ashford Hollow, Mara received an unexpected piece of correspondence from Diane that reignited her growing concern regarding the broader network's true scope and danger. Diane explained that she had located, within the same academic journal that had originally hinted at an organized, ancient effort behind the network's establishment, a more detailed reference suggesting the existence of a central, coordinating location somewhere within the region, described only vaguely as a place where the network's original architects had supposedly gathered to establish and oversee their scattered system of containment sites. The journal article, written by a now-deceased regional folklorist decades earlier, offered no clear indication of this central location's specific whereabouts, though it hinted that local legend associated it with an unusually old and largely unexplored network of natural caves located somewhere within the mountainous terrain separating BlackWell and Ashford Hollow from several other communities throughout the wider region. Mara felt a fresh surge of both excitement and apprehension at this discovery, recognizing that locating and investigating this potential central site might finally offer some genuine insight into the network's true, complete origins and purpose, information that could prove invaluable in helping communities throughout the region better understand and prepare for their own respective containment responsibilities. She discussed this new lead with Ellis and Sheriff Pruitt, both of whom expressed considerable interest tempered by obvious caution, recognizing that investigating such an ancient, potentially dangerous location carried significant risk, particularly given everything they had already witnessed regarding the violent, unpredictable dangers associated with the network's individual containment sites throughout the region. After considerable discussion, Mara, Ellis, and Sheriff Pruitt agreed that investigating the potential central location represented a worthwhile, if cautious, undertaking, reasoning that a more complete understanding of the network's true origins might ultimately prove essential to preventing future catastrophic failures similar to what had occurred in both BlackWell and Ashford Hollow. They invited Diane to join their investigation, given her extensive research expertise and personal experience surviving Ashford Hollow's own recent crisis, and together the four of them began planning a careful, methodical expedition into the mountainous cave system the old folklorist's journal article had vaguely referenced as a potential central location for the network's ancient origins. They spent several weeks preparing thoroughly for this expedition, researching available maps and geological surveys of the region's cave systems, gathering appropriate equipment and supplies, and consulting with a small number of trusted, experienced local cavers who possessed genuine expertise navigating the area's extensive, largely unexplored underground terrain. Mara found herself experiencing a complicated mixture of genuine scholarly curiosity and persistent, underlying dread as their preparations progressed, understanding that whatever they might discover within these ancient caves could prove either illuminating or catastrophically dangerous, depending on exactly what remained of the network's original architects or whatever ancient, powerful forces they had once gathered together to properly understand and control before establishing their scattered system of regional containment sites many centuries or possibly even millennia earlier. The expedition finally began on a clear, cold morning in early winter. Mara, Ellis, Diane, and two experienced local cavers named Jorge and Patricia setting out together into the mountainous terrain where the old folklorist journal had suggested the network's central location might be found. They spent the better part of 2 days exploring the extensive cave system's outer chambers, finding little of immediate significance beyond ordinary geological formations and occasional evidence of ancient, prehistoric human habitation that offered no direct connection to the specific ancient network they were hoping to investigate further. On the third day, however, Jorge discovered a narrow, previously unexplored passage leading deeper into the mountain's interior, its entrance partially concealed behind a natural rock formation that had apparently obscured it from previous, less thorough exploration efforts. The group cautiously followed this newly discovered passage for nearly an hour, eventually emerging into a large, previously unknown chamber whose walls bore extensive, deliberate carvings and markings that immediately caught Mara's attention, patterns and symbols bearing clear, unmistakable resemblance to the protective markings she had previously discovered within both BlackWell's and Ashford Hollow's oldest historical documents. Diane approached the carved walls with obvious excitement, carefully documenting and photographing every visible symbol while explaining that these markings appeared considerably older and more elaborate than anything either of them had previously encountered throughout their years of dedicated research into the region's ancient, mysterious containment traditions. As the group explored this newly discovered chamber more thoroughly, Diane identified several distinct clusters of carved symbols that appeared to represent different specific locations throughout the wider region, each marked with what she theorized might indicate the relative strength or nature of the ancient presence contained at that particular site. She located symbols she believed corresponded to both BlackWell's own Hargrove Scarecrow tradition and Ashford Hollow's recently resolved Hollow Man crisis, along with numerous additional markings suggesting the existence of at least a dozen other similar containment sites scattered throughout the broader region, some considerably more distant than Mara had previously suspected the ancient network might actually extend. Mara felt a chill of genuine unease as she studied these additional markings, recognizing that the true scope of whatever ancient danger their region's earliest inhabitants had once attempted to understand and contain likely exceeded anything she, Ellis, or even Diane's extensive research had previously managed to fully appreciate or comprehend. Ellis, examining a particularly elaborate central carving that appeared to depict some kind of larger, more powerful figure surrounded by the smaller, individual site markings, asked Diane whether she believed this central image might represent the network's ultimate, original source, the singular ancient presence or force from which all the individual, scattered containment sites had somehow been derived or established. Diane admitted she could not be certain, though she pointed out with growing unease that the central figure's carved proportions and menacing posture suggested something considerably more vast and dangerous than any of the individual manifestations they had personally encountered throughout their respective communities' own localized crises. The group continued exploring the ancient chamber for several additional hours, carefully documenting every visible carving and symbol while searching for any additional passages or chambers that might yield further insight into the network's true, complete history and purpose. Patricia eventually discovered a narrow crevice near the chamber's rear wall that appeared to lead even deeper into the mountain's interior, though the passage's extremely tight dimensions would require considerable caution and specialized equipment to safely navigate any further. Mara felt a strong, persistent urge to continue their investigation despite the obvious risks involved, recognizing that whatever additional information lay concealed within these deeper, unexplored passages might prove crucial to finally understanding the true nature and scope of the ancient danger their region's communities had spent countless generations attempting to contain and manage without ever fully comprehending its complete, underlying origin. Ellis, however, expressed considerable reluctance to proceed further given the day's rapidly diminishing remaining daylight and their group's limited specialized caving equipment, suggesting instead that they document their current findings thoroughly and return at a later date with more appropriate resources and additional expert assistance to properly and safely continue their investigation into the tantalizing, unexplored depths still awaiting discovery beyond the narrow crevice Patricia had located. After considerable discussion, the group reluctantly agreed with Ellis's cautious, practical assessment, and began the careful process of documenting their significant discoveries before making their way back toward the cave system's entrance, all of them acutely aware that they had likely only begun to scratch the surface of whatever ancient, complex truth lay concealed within the mountain's deeper, still unexplored recesses. As the group made their way back toward the cave entrance, Mara found herself reflecting on the profound implications of everything they had just discovered, recognizing that the ancient network connecting BlackWell, Ashford Hollow, and numerous other regional communities represented something considerably more organized, deliberate, and ancient than she had ever previously imagined during her years of cautious, incremental research into the mystery. She discussed these implications with Diane as they walked, both of them agreeing that their newfound discovery warranted careful, methodical follow-up investigation, potentially involving additional academic experts who might help properly interpret and contextualize the ancient carvings and symbols they had documented throughout the chamber. Ellis remained largely quiet during this conversation, apparently lost in his own thoughts regarding the discovery's significance for his family's own ancestral responsibility maintaining BlackWell's particular containment site, and Mara noticed a troubled, contemplative expression on his face that suggested he was grappling with implications considerably more personal and weighty than the purely academic interest driving much of Diane's own enthusiastic research agenda. When Mara asked him directly what specifically concerned him, Ellis admitted that the central carving depicting some larger, more powerful ancient presence had left him deeply unsettled, wondering aloud whether BlackWell's own scarecrow, and indeed every other individual containment site throughout the entire regional network, might ultimately represent merely fragmented pieces or extensions of some single, far more massive and dangerous underlying entity, a possibility that, if accurate, would suggest their region's collective, generational containment efforts had perhaps never truly addressed the actual, complete scope of whatever ancient danger their ancestors had originally encountered and attempted to understand so many centuries or millennia earlier. Mara found Ellis's unsettling theory difficult to dismiss, recognizing that it aligned troublingly well with certain patterns she had noticed throughout her own research, particularly the apparent sympathetic connection that had caused BlackWell's own scarecrow to exhibit unusual movement during the height of Ashford Hollow's separate, distant crisis. If Ellis's theory proved accurate, she reasoned, it would suggest that successfully containing any individual manifestation throughout the network, as they had managed to achieve both in BlackWell 5 years earlier and more recently in Ashford Hollow, represented only a temporary, localized victory against a single fragment of some far larger, more persistent underlying danger that continued to exist and potentially exert influence across the network's entire scattered collection of individual containment sites. She raised this troubling possibility with Diane once they returned to more comfortable surroundings, and Diane, after careful consideration, agreed that the theory offered a plausible explanation for several patterns she had noticed throughout her own extensive historical research, including the apparent similarity in ritual structure and incantation wording across multiple different regional traditions despite their otherwise distinct, independently developed historical documentation. Sheriff Pruitt, upon hearing this developing theory, expressed considerable concern regarding its practical implications for BlackWell's own long-term safety, questioning whether their community's current containment strategy, however successfully executed during each individual blood moon cycle, might ultimately prove insufficient against whatever larger, more persistent danger continued to exist beneath the surface of their region's collective, generational efforts at localized, incomplete containment. In the weeks following their significant cave discovery, Mara, Ellis, and Diane worked to establish contact with several additional academic experts specializing in regional folklore and archaeology, hoping to gain professional assistance properly interpreting the ancient carvings and symbols they had documented throughout the newly discovered chamber. This process proved considerably more delicate and challenging than any of them had initially anticipated, requiring careful navigation of the same fundamental tension that had characterized their entire ongoing investigation, the need to gather genuine, expert assistance while simultaneously avoiding revealing too much of the network's true, dangerous nature to individuals who lacked their own hard-won, personal understanding of the very real, violent stakes involved. They eventually connected with a retired university archaeologist named Professor Samuel Kessler, who had spent considerable portions of his career studying similar ancient symbol systems throughout other regions of the country, and who expressed genuine, professional interest in examining their documented findings, though Mara remained cautious about revealing the full, dangerous truth regarding the network's actual, active supernatural significance. Kessler's initial analysis of their photographed carvings suggested the symbols likely originated from a period considerably older than the region's earliest documented Native American settlements, potentially connecting to an even more ancient, largely unknown civilization whose historical existence remained almost entirely absent from any conventional academic or archaeological record currently available. This revelation left Mara and her companions with a profound, unsettling sense that the true, complete history behind their region's dangerous, ancient network extended back through a timeline considerably longer and more mysterious than any of them had previously dared to seriously consider or investigate. As winter deepened and the next scheduled blood moon cycle drew steadily closer, Mara found herself increasingly torn between her ongoing, expanding investigation into the network's ancient origins and her primary, essential responsibility helping Ellis and BlackWell's broader community of participating founding families prepare for their own upcoming, carefully scheduled containment ceremony. She discussed this growing tension with Ellis, who gently but firmly reminded her that regardless of whatever larger, more complex truth their continued research might eventually reveal regarding the network's ultimate origin and scope, BlackWell's immediate, practical safety depended entirely on their continued, faithful maintenance of the specific ritual obligations his own family had inherited across so many careful, dedicated generations. Mara recognized the wisdom in Ellis's perspective, acknowledging that her growing fascination with the network's broader, more theoretical implications risked distracting from the more immediate, essential work still required to ensure BlackWell's own particular danger remained properly, safely contained through each successive blood moon cycle. She resolved to prioritize her local responsibilities more carefully going forward, treating her broader regional investigation as a secondary, longer-term project that would proceed cautiously alongside, rather than in competition with, her primary commitment to BlackWell's continued safety and successful, ongoing containment efforts. As the community's preparations for the upcoming ceremony progressed smoothly, benefiting from the considerable institutional knowledge and organizational structure they had developed over the preceding 5 years of successful, collaborative stewardship, Mara found herself hoping fervently that this particular cycle would proceed without incident, allowing her continued freedom to pursue her broader research interests without the constant, exhausting distraction of an immediate, local crisis. Competing for her urgent attention, the blood moon ceremony proceeded successfully once again, the Hargrove scarecrow remaining peacefully dormant throughout the carefully executed ritual, and Mara felt a familiar wave of relief wash over her as the assembled participants gradually dispersed following the ceremony's uneventful conclusion. In the days following the successful cycle, she resumed her broader regional research with renewed focus, continuing her collaboration with Professor Kessler while maintaining regular correspondence with Diane regarding Ashford Hollow's own continued, successful stewardship of their previously abandoned Corwin family tradition. Kessler eventually suggested that their documented cave carvings might benefit from comparison against similar ancient symbol systems he had previously studied in other, geographically distant regions of the country, raising the unsettling possibility that the network Mara and her companions had discovered might represent merely one regional manifestation within an even larger, continental or perhaps even global pattern of similar ancient containment traditions, each independently developed by different, isolated communities throughout human history in response to some universal, widespread danger whose true nature and origin remained entirely unknown to modern science or conventional historical understanding. Mara found this expanding scope of potential danger both intellectually fascinating and deeply, persistently unsettling, recognizing that her own community's particular struggle with the Hargrove family scarecrow represented, in this broader context, merely a single small thread within an almost incomprehensibly vast and ancient tapestry of similar human efforts to understand and contain forces that had apparently troubled and threatened isolated communities throughout countless generations and geographic regions extending far beyond anything she had ever previously imagined possible during her own relatively limited, localized investigation. As spring gradually arrived and BlackWell's fields began their familiar seasonal transformation from winter dormancy into renewed agricultural activity, Mara received word from Diane regarding a new, deeply troubling development in Ashford Hollow, an unexplained series of livestock deaths occurring throughout the surrounding countryside that bore unsettling similarities to reports Mara recalled from her own research into historical incidents preceding both BlackWell's and Ashford Hollow's previous catastrophic crises. Diane explained that Sheriff Boone and the volunteer stewardship group had immediately intensified their monitoring of the Hollow Man's current dormant condition, though preliminary inspection suggested the ancient effigy remained peacefully inactive, showing none of the unusual restlessness or movement that had previously preceded actual, dangerous awakening. This news left Mara feeling considerably uneasy despite the reassuring absence of any direct evidence connecting the livestock deaths to Ashford Hollow's own particular containment tradition, wondering whether these unexplained incidents might instead represent early warning signs of trouble brewing at some entirely different, currently unidentified site throughout the broader regional network. They continued to investigate and map with painstaking, methodical care. She shared this concerning development with Ellis and Sheriff Pruitt, and together they discussed whether their growing network of regional contacts might benefit from establishing some kind of more formal, coordinated early warning system, allowing different communities throughout the wider area to share relevant information more efficiently regarding any unusual, potentially significant occurrences that might indicate developing trouble at containment sites beyond their own immediate, direct knowledge or established communication channels. Over the following weeks, Mara, Ellis, Diane, and Sheriff Boone began working together to establish a more formal, structured communication network connecting the various communities throughout the region that had, through their own separate and often initially reluctant investigations, discovered evidence of their own participation in the broader ancient containment system. This effort proved considerably challenging, requiring careful, delicate outreach to communities whose own local traditions remained, in several cases, poorly understood or entirely unknown even to their current residents, similar to the tragic circumstances that had left Ashford Hollow so dangerously unprepared when their own Hollow Man had finally broken free of its long-neglected containment. Professor Kessler proved unexpectedly valuable in this expanding effort, using his professional academic connections and reputation to help identify and cautiously approach several additional communities whose historical records suggested potential involvement in the broader network. Though careful, ongoing discretion remained essential throughout this delicate outreach process to avoid triggering unnecessary panic or unwanted, potentially dangerous outside attention from parties who might respond to such sensitive revelations with considerably less measured caution than the small, dedicated circle of researchers and community stewards had gradually developed through their own hard-won, personal experience. By early summer, this expanding network had successfully identified and established cautious contact with representatives from 4 additional communities throughout the wider region, each maintaining their own separate, isolated version of the ancient containment tradition, and together this growing coalition began the careful, collaborative work of sharing knowledge and coordinating strategies that might eventually help every participating community better understand and prepare for whatever ancient, widespread danger their shared, interconnected system had been established to contain across so many countless generations of careful, dedicated stewardship. As this expanding regional network continued developing throughout the summer months, Mara found herself traveling periodically to meet with representatives from these newly identified communities, gradually building the kind of trusted, collaborative relationships that had proven so essential in successfully addressing Ashford Hollow's own recent crisis. She discovered, through these expanding conversations, considerable variation in how different communities had approached their own inherited containment responsibilities, some maintaining careful, well-documented traditions similar to BlackWell's own long-standing practice, while others had allowed their knowledge to fade nearly to the point of complete loss, similar to the tragic circumstances that had nearly doomed Ashford Hollow before their own crisis forced a desperate, last-minute reconstruction of long-forgotten, essential practices. This growing understanding of the network's varied, uneven state of preparation throughout the region left Mara increasingly convinced that establishing some kind of formal, ongoing coordination and mutual support system represented an essential, valuable undertaking, potentially helping prevent future catastrophic failures similar to what had already occurred, in various forms, throughout both her own hometown's history and the more recent crisis she had personally helped address in Ashford Hollow. She discussed these observations regularly with Ellis, who remained supportive of the broader coordination effort while continuing to emphasize the primary importance of maintaining BlackWell's own local tradition with the same careful, dedicated attention that had successfully carried their community through 5 consecutive, successful blood moon cycles since that first catastrophic night that had originally brought Mara back into direct, personal contact with her hometown's ancient, dangerous inheritance. As autumn approached once again, bringing with it the familiar anticipation of BlackWell's own upcoming blood moon ceremony, Mara received a significant piece of correspondence from Professor Kessler, describing a breakthrough in his ongoing analysis of the cave carvings they had discovered together earlier that year. Kessler explained that he had finally managed to properly translate a significant portion of the ancient symbol system's central, most elaborate carving, the one depicting what Ellis had previously theorized might represent the network's original, singular source or ultimate underlying danger. According to Kessler's careful analysis, the symbols suggested that the ancient architects who had originally established the network had not created or summoned whatever dangerous presence the system was designed to contain, but had instead discovered it already existing within the region's ancient landscape, a presence considerably older than even their own now largely forgotten civilization, and had developed their elaborate system of localized containment sites specifically because they had determined, through their own careful ancient study, that fully destroying or banishing the entity entirely lay beyond their available capability or understanding. This revelation left Mara with a complicated, unsettling mixture of validation and renewed concern, confirming Ellis's earlier theoretical suspicions while simultaneously suggesting that the ancient danger connecting BlackWell, Ashford Hollow, and every other identified site throughout the broader network likely represented something considerably more powerful, ancient, and fundamentally unresolvable than any contemporary community, regardless of how dedicated or well-organized, could realistically hope to permanently eliminate through their own limited, localized efforts at careful, generational containment. Mara shared Kessler's significant translation breakthrough with Ellis, Diane, and the broader network of regional community representatives they had spent the preceding months carefully cultivating, and the resulting discussion revealed a shared, sobering acknowledgement among the entire group that their collective efforts likely represented an ongoing, indefinite responsibility rather than any hope of eventually achieving a complete, permanent resolution to the ancient danger their various communities had each inherited responsibility for containing across so many countless generations. This realization, while difficult to fully accept, ultimately strengthened the group's collective resolve to continue developing their expanding regional coordination network, recognizing that shared knowledge, mutual support, and careful, ongoing vigilance likely represented the most realistic and sustainable approach available to them, rather than any unrealistic hope of somehow discovering a definitive, permanent solution that had apparently eluded even the network's original, considerably more advanced ancient architects many centuries or millennia earlier. Ellis, in particular, seemed to find a measure of genuine peace in this sobering but clarifying understanding, explaining to Mara that he had always privately harbored some hope that sufficient research and dedication might eventually reveal a way to permanently end his family's ancestral burden entirely, but that accepting the true, ongoing nature of their shared responsibility allowed him to focus more constructively on ensuring BlackWell's own tradition remained as safely and reliably maintained as possible for whatever future generations might eventually inherit responsibility for its continued, careful stewardship long after his own eventual passing. As the day of BlackWell's sixth consecutive blood moon ceremony finally arrived, Mara found herself experiencing a strange, complicated blend of familiar, practiced confidence and persistent, underlying awareness of the vastly larger, more ancient context her ongoing research had revealed throughout the preceding year. The ceremony itself proceeded with the same smooth, well-organized efficiency that had characterized every successful cycle since the community had first established their expanded, collaborative stewardship structure following Thomas Hargrove's tragic death 6 years earlier. As the ritual concluded successfully, the ancient scarecrow remaining peacefully dormant throughout, Mara found herself reflecting on how profoundly her understanding of BlackWell's particular danger had evolved since that first anxious autumn when she had simply followed her grandmother's old superstitious habit of circling certain dates on the kitchen calendar, never suspecting the vast, ancient, and troublingly unresolved network of danger those dates had always actually represented. She now understood, with hard-won clarity, that her hometown's own particular struggle represented merely one small, carefully managed thread within an almost incomprehensibly ancient and widespread tapestry of similar human efforts, stretching back through countless generations and extending, quite possibly, far beyond the borders of her own familiar region into territories and communities she had not yet even begun to properly investigate or understand. As the assembled participants began their familiar, relieved dispersal following the ceremony's successful conclusion, Mara found herself already turning her thoughts toward the network's continued expansion and development, wondering what additional communities, dangers, and revelations still awaited discovery throughout the vast, ancient system she had only just begun to genuinely comprehend. In the months following this sixth successful ceremony, the regional network Mara had helped establish continued its careful, deliberate growth, eventually identifying and cautiously contacting representatives from 3 additional communities throughout the wider area, each contributing their own fragmentary historical knowledge and practical experience to the group's ongoing, collective effort at better understanding and managing their shared, ancient inheritance. Professor Kessler continued his detailed analysis of the cave carvings, gradually translating additional passages that offered further insight into the network's true, ancient history, though significant portions of the carved symbol system remained frustratingly difficult to fully decipher even after considerable dedicated academic effort. Mara found herself settling into a comfortable, if permanently altered, rhythm of life that balanced her ongoing regional research and coordination efforts alongside her continued, primary commitment to BlackWell's own local safety and successful, ongoing containment tradition. She maintained her position as a BlackWell deputy, finding genuine satisfaction in both her ordinary law enforcement duties and her unofficial but deeply meaningful role as one of the region's most experienced and trusted coordinators for the broader, ancient network's continued, collaborative stewardship. Ellis similarly settled into his own evolving role, having gradually transformed from a reluctant, isolated inheritor of a poorly understood family burden into a genuinely respected leader within the expanding regional community of stewards, his careful, methodical approach to BlackWell's own tradition increasingly serving as a valuable model for other communities working to establish or restore their own similarly essential, ongoing containment practices throughout the wider area. As the following winter settled over BlackWell's quiet, snow-covered fields, Mara received an intriguing piece of correspondence from one of the network's newest participating communities, a small town roughly 200 miles distant whose local historian had recently discovered evidence suggesting their own containment tradition might be tied to an entirely different celestial trigger than either the blood-moon cycle governing BlackWell's scarecrow or the rare stellar alignment that had originally awakened Ashford Hollow's Hollow Man. This new community's historian described their own tradition as apparently connected to a specific, recurring solar eclipse pattern, suggesting that the broader network's original ancient architects had perhaps deliberately established different triggering mechanisms across various sites throughout the region, possibly as some form of built-in safeguard designed to prevent multiple sites from becoming simultaneously vulnerable during any single celestial event. Mara found this theory both fascinating and deeply reassuring, recognizing that if accurate, it suggested the network's original architects had indeed possessed considerably more sophisticated understanding and foresight than she had previously credited them with, designing their scattered system of containment sites with deliberate, staggered vulnerability windows specifically to minimize the risk of catastrophic, simultaneous failure across multiple locations at once. She shared this promising theory with Ellis, Diane, and the broader network of regional coordinators, and together they began discussing whether mapping out each participating community's specific celestial trigger might eventually allow them to develop a more comprehensive, predictive calendar system, potentially helping every community throughout the network better anticipate and prepare for their own respective periods of heightened risk and required ritual vigilance. As Mara continued her work throughout that winter, coordinating with the growing network of regional communities while maintaining her own primary responsibilities in BlackWell, she found herself reflecting increasingly on how thoroughly her life had transformed since that first, seemingly ordinary autumn evening when she had simply noticed her grandmother's old, circled date on the kitchen calendar. What had begun as a personal, localized mystery confined to her own hometown's particular danger had gradually expanded into a genuinely regional, collaborative effort involving numerous communities, dedicated researchers, and an increasingly sophisticated understanding of an ancient danger whose true scope and origin likely extended far beyond anything she could have possibly imagined during those first anxious days following her return to BlackWell so many years earlier. She maintained regular contact with Diane and Sheriff Boone in Ashford Hollow, both of whom continued successfully managing their own community's ongoing stewardship of the Hollow Man, their tradition gradually becoming as carefully documented and reliably maintained as BlackWell's own long-standing practice had eventually become through years of dedicated, collaborative effort. Professor Kessler continued his patient, methodical academic analysis of the ancient cave carvings, occasionally sharing additional fragments of translated insight that gradually expanded everyone's collective understanding of the network's true, ancient history and purpose, even as significant portions of that history remained frustratingly, perhaps permanently, beyond complete human comprehension given the vast span of time separating their own contemporary efforts from whatever ancient civilization had first established this elaborate, ongoing system of regional containment so many centuries or millennia earlier. As another blood moon cycle approached on BlackWell's horizon, now the seventh since that first catastrophic night that had claimed Thomas Hargrove's life and forever changed the trajectory of Mara's own personal and professional existence, she found herself standing once more at the edge of the Hargrove family's ancestral cornfield, watching the familiar, weathered scarecrow stand its silent, dormant vigil beneath a clear, star-filled autumn sky. She thought of everything that had transpired since her original return to this quiet, unassuming farming town, the horror of that first violent night, the desperate improvisation that had ultimately saved the community, the years of careful, collaborative rebuilding that had followed, and the profound, expanding discovery of an ancient, region-spanning network whose true origins and complete purpose still remained only partially understood despite years of dedicated, methodical research. She thought too of Ashford Hollow's own parallel crisis, of Diane and Sheriff Boone's continued, dedicated stewardship, and of the growing coalition of communities throughout the wider region now working together, however cautiously and incompletely, toward a shared understanding of the ancient danger connecting them all. As Ellis approached to begin their own community's careful, practiced preparations for the coming ceremony, Mara felt a complicated mixture of hard-won confidence and persistent, underlying awareness that their work, however successful and important, likely represented only one small, ongoing chapter within a far larger, ancient story that would continue unfolding across countless future generations, in BlackWell and beyond, wherever else throughout the region's vast, mysterious landscape. Similar ancient dangers continued to lie in patient, watchful dormancy, waiting, as such ancient things always eventually do, for their own next opportunity to stir once more beneath the quiet, deceptively peaceful surface of the world above. If you like this video and want to hear more like it, subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one.